This is FE Peer Review. The date is August the 5th, 2021. This is a response to a video of a long-distance observation of Chicago across Lake Michigan, but specifically it's regarding comment and questions by Lunacy Lander, who left these comments in the comment stream for the video. The video is by Bob the Science Guy on his Research Flat Moon channel, and we will take a look at that now. A couple of days ago, Dr. Bob, who has the Research Flat Moon channel, did a nice little video on the use of a Earth curve calculator. And there was a comment that came up in the comment stream that I wanted to remark on and discuss a little bit. Lunacy Lander wrote, "This is all based on Lake Michigan being smooth as glass in its entirety. Which direction is the sun? What are the light angles? What's the temperature?" And then he says further down, "I understand you can calculate refraction. My point is the only thing you can see is available light. What were the exact weather conditions that day? Depending on the angles of light and water conditions, you can see swells as large as 20 to 25 feet on Lake Michigan. They wouldn't block anything? This is the same argument you guys use to explain boats disappearing over the horizon, but globe proponents never consider the features of water. Swells, waves, peaks, and valleys is such a simple thing. It's always ignored, though." So he brings up a couple of questions. Oh, and then he mentions Mount San Jacinto as well. Same can be done with elevations, land features to push Mount San Jacinto into question. So he brings up a number of different items: waves, swells, weather conditions, refraction, land features, a bunch of different stuff. So I responded to that. "Oh, you can see swells as large as 20 to 25 feet on Lake Michigan. Sometimes it helps to take things like this one detail at a time instead of throwing every possible complication into the mix all at once. Let's take a look at the swells. 20 to 25 feet sounds very high to me, unusually high. Perhaps it happens. I'm not doubting that. Did it happen the day of the photo? I think the person who took it, a local journalist, would have mentioned that. Regardless, we will work on the assumption that there were 25-foot swells. Can you answer this question? If the observer is 180 feet above the lake, what is the maximum amount a 25-foot swell can block of the view of a building across the lake? If you could give me your answer to that question and how you came about it, I'd like to hear it. Then I'll be happy to share with you my answer and how I came about it. We can compare." So that's what I'm doing. I'm working on my answer. And I should mention that 180-foot figure there. I didn't just pull that out of a hat. That was the location where the journalist Nowicki was when he took his photo. So it's an actual observation height for the photo that we just saw. This photo up here in the video. There we go. There. Joshua Nowicki. Look up that name and you can find his original article about this, which had nothing to do with Earth curvature and all that. All right, now let's take a look at a few diagrams I put together. Let's start with this one at the top. I've got this green object on the left, which indicates the observer, and I've got the observer at the top of it. So it could be a person standing on a 180-foot bluff, or it could be a 6-foot tall person standing on the beach. At the right end, I've got the object being observed, and then I have randomly placed 3 obstructions between them. None of this is to any particular scale. I didn't draw them to any particular size, except in this first diagram, my point was to look at when the obstructions are lower than the observer, how do they affect the observation? We see that the one in the closest one, the observer sees over it to the ground quite close, and this is a flat ground plane, by the way. If we look at the second obstruction, more of the ground surface is concealed, but the observer still sees the ground in front of the building. In other words, these 2 obstructions, here and here, do not obstruct the view of the building. They only obstruct the view of the ground behind them. The third obstruction, which is right up against the building, prevents the observer from seeing the bottom part of the building. So on the basis of a flat surface, with these objects all on the same plane, and with observation line with line of sight being considered a straight line, we can see that it's geometrically impossible for this obstruction to conceal more of the building than its own height. That's the case when the observer is above the obstruction. Now let's look at when the observer is below the obstruction. Still talking about a flat plane here. Our observer's on the left, and you see he's a much smaller figure now. The observation point is below the eye level of the obstructions. And what we see is that the closest obstruction not only hides the building, a significant amount of the building, it also hides completely the other two obstructions. The further back each obstruction gets, the less of the building it hides. So if we pretend that this first one's not here, then we're looking at the second obstruction. It's hiding less of the building than the first did. Same with the third. So we've seen basically the two possible cases for a flat plane. The first case being when the observer is above, the second being when the observer is below the obstruction. Now let's look at a curved surface. I haven't attempted to draw this to any particular scale again, but you'll see here I have put the observer above, taller than the obstructions, and these lines of sight pretty much have the same effect as in the previous. The obstructions only hide the ground behind them. They hide a bit more of the ground behind them, but they don't hide the building. Only the obstruction immediately in front of the building hides the base of the building. And again, it's only hiding as much as its own height. It can't hide more than the building. So in that respect, it's similar to the first example. But now let's look at the second one. This is where it starts to get a little more interesting. I've brought the observer down a little bit, but it's still, let me show them both side by side. The observer is now closer to the ground, but still higher than the obstructions. So this is a variation on that first case. And what we see is that this middle obstruction, which previously did not block a view of the building, it only blocked the view of some of the ground behind it, now actually blocks the base of the building. And what's really interesting here, it blocks more than its own height. As you can see from the little one in front here, this middle obstruction is concealing more of the base of the building than its own height. Now that's something that we found was geometrically impossible on a flat plane. When the observer is higher above the plane than the obstructions, there's no way that the obstruction can hide more than its own height. However, when the objects are not on a flat plane, when they're on a curved surface, even though the observer is higher above the surface than the obstruction can indeed hide more of the object in the distance than its own height. So what we've identified now is a situation which cannot happen on a flat plane, but can happen on a curve. So if we were to find such a situation, if we were to identify such a situation in nature, a physical observation, we would have found an observation that can't be made on a flat plane but can be made on a curve. Now this is the same diagram we were just looking at, except that I have added a red dashed line. Now when I drew this diagram and put the curve in there and put the objects on it, I wasn't really trying to line things up in any particular way, other than I knew I wanted this to be a little bigger. I wanted the observer to be a little bigger than the obstructions and so forth. But I wasn't really trying to make a real precise alignment on anything. I'm bringing up this dashed red line here because what I found after I had created the diagram was that I actually placed the building very close to the tangent. That red line is a line of sight from the observer tangent to the curved surface. And I placed the base of the building actually very close to that tangent point, which is effectively the horizon, the geometric horizon. So that's just how I happened to draw this diagram by accident, basically. Which means that, in fact, without any of these obstructions, the observer would see the base of the building in this particular case. So I went ahead and made a second here, where I increased the amount of curvature so that I could have that tangent line, tangent to the curve, clearly hiding a portion of the base of the building. And then I added the obstruction back in there. And we see still that the amount hidden by the obstruction, the height of the amount hidden is more than the height of the obstruction itself. And that's even though the obstruction is lower, closer to the ground than the observer. So what does this tell us about the photo we were looking at and the question that was being asked about swells? Well, yeah, there could be swells possibly creating this effect. Geometrically, it seems to be possible. It's worth pointing out that although the observer is at a higher elevation than the obstruction or the swell on Lake Michigan, is not much higher. I've made this obstruction pretty large compared to the observation point. So if the observer is 180 feet above the water surface, this would be a huge object, like 120 feet or 130 feet or something. It's obviously not to scale, and it's obviously very large compared to any sort of swell. And so my point is that in order to determine whether swells of 25 feet on Lake Michigan are affecting that photo, we need to do the math. Well, we can't really do the math without the data. We don't have data on the size of the swells when that photograph was taken. It's unlikely they were 25 feet high because that would have been a newsworthy event, and the photograph was being taken by a journalist, so the journalist would probably have reported on quite some amazing water activity that evening when he took that photograph. But regardless, if we don't have the data, so we can't say for sure without the data. What we can say for sure is that it only matters, the swells only matter if the surface we're talking about is curved. Because we saw that in the first example, if the observer is above the obstruction, no matter how big that obstruction is, no matter how large that wave is on Lake Michigan, if it's lower than the observer's elevation, it will never conceal more than its own height on a flat plane. So really, it's only an issue, and the very fact that it may be an issue is dependent on everything being on a curved surface. So yeah, we need to do the math in order to be able to calculate better exactly whether or not swells on the lake are contributing to the hiding of the base of those buildings. However, they can only be contributing if the earth is curved. So there you go, folks. That's the news, and I hope you found it interesting. I don't feel like I thought about doing this to scale, but it's so hard to draw these things to scale. Here, look at the bottom of the screen. Let's get rid of this red line. Look at the bottom of the screen here. I've drawn a scale line here. That's 1 mile, that's 10 miles, 20, 30, 40, 50, 56 miles across the bottom. Now I'm going to zoom in at the starting point, and you will see a little green rectangle up here. That there is my 180-foot observation height. And zooming back out and zooming in at the other end, that there is Sears Tower, or whatever it's called these days. So a scale drawing would be kind of fun. I don't know, maybe I'll get to it. But as you can see, the whole thing isn't even a concern unless we've already found that the ground is curved. It can't be an issue if the ground is flat. Okay, that's enough. I'm starting to ramble, so I will call this ended. Wish you all a pleasant evening, and please hit that subscribe button, share this with friends, and leave comments. Thank you. Bye-bye.